Magandang araw! Patuloy po tayo sa ating pong pag-aaral ng The Bible That Jesus Read, a study of the Old Testament based on the book by Philip Yancey. At ito po ay pagpapatuloy ng ating pong pag-aaral on Ecclesiastes, the end of wisdom. Noong pong 1960s, ay nagkaroon po ng panibagong movement sa kalagitnaan po nung kumakalat po na hippie culture. So, ang movement po na ito is known as existentialism. And ito po ay pinakalat ng ilang mga figures gaya ni John Paul Sartre, Soren Kierkegaard, Friedrich Nietzsche, and si Ernest Hemingway. Ang tema po ng mga existentialists is mabubuhay tayo at mamamatay, para saan pa ang buhay na ito? So, kung tutusin, on first, sa unang tingin po, ang Ecclesiastes parang existentialist po ang approach niya sa buhay. Remember, yung pong keyword sa Ecclesiastes, which is hebel, or literally vapor, or hininga, or mist, translated as meaningless, it appears more than 30 times throughout the book. And parang ito po yung pinaka-tema niya from beginning to end. The issues that bother the teacher still bother us today. Yung mayayaman, mas lalong yung mayaman. Yung mga mabubuting tao, naghihirap sila. Evil people prosper and reign. And poor people, they do good and yet they die early. So, nothing makes sense. Everything is unfair. The world doesn't balance out. Kung titignan naman po natin ang Ecclesiastes sa katabi niya sa Proverbs, makikita po natin na ang laki po ng difference. Dito po sa Proverbs, merong confidence na kailangan magkaroon ka ng wisdom, maging simple ka sa buhay, follow the rules for a long and peaceful life. Dito sa Ecclesiastes, none of the proverbs seem to work out. Even wisdom, parang wala rin, mamamatay ka rin lang din eh. Mababasa natin yan sa chapter 3, verses 19 to 20 ng Ecclesiastes. It's quite interesting to note that yung pong philosophical or yung idea, a theory of existentialism, hindi po siya nanggaling mula sa kahirapan. But this was born in the midst of prosperity. Si Sartre, sinulat niya ang lahat ng ito habang siya ay nagre-relax sa isang cafe sa Paris. Sa kalagitnaan ng isa sa pinakamaganda at pinakamaunlad na city sa buong mundo. Gaya ng natutunan po natin sa previous na session po natin, isinulat ang Ecclesiastes most likely with Israel at the peak of its golden age. Isang time na napaka-unlad at napaka-ganda ng kahihinatnan or ng kalagayan ng buong kingdom. Ayon kay Walker Percy, na nagsulat ng Message in a Bottle, despair comes not out of need but more likely in circumstances of plenty. Yung parang nakuha mo na lahat, para saan ito? People trapped in poverty or in concentration camps do not dwell on the meaninglessness of life, pero ang focus nila, kailangan mabuhay ako. I need to survive. People living in luxury or enjoying the good life find themselves running in circles and they ask the question, what am I living for? The problems of this modern age ironically have come from a quest to make life better. Yung mga problema na meron po tayo ay nagbunga dahil gusto natin na mas maging maganda po ang buhay. Yung kaunladan na nagbigay po sa atin ng mga washing machines, mga vaccines, mga airplanes, nagpabilis ng ating pong pagbabiyahe, it is also the progress that also gave us nuclear weapons, carcinogens, and global warming. Natuto po tayo na wag mamatay ng maaga and mas pahabain po natin ng buhay. Pero we fail to provide meaning. Lalo na kung buhay ka nga, pero nakakabit ka naman sa isang makina. We seem to have taken upon ourselves yung tinatawag na burden of the gods. Ito pong burden po na ito, yung pong sinisikap na unawain po nung preacher or the teacher. And through most of Ecclesiastes, makikita po natin or mababasa natin na siya ay parang overwhelmed nung burden po na yon. Yung pagtatrabaho, wisdom, pagiging mabuti, parang dun sa preacher, baliwala lang lahat kasi mamamatay din tayo lahat. The teacher ultimately realizes that no one is truly righteous in his own regard. And sin is the root of all trouble. Nevertheless, the teacher offers glimpses of hope. He rightly advocates that living in wisdom and righteousness is still better than a life of folly and darkness. Mas mabuti nang mamuhay ka ng may wisdom at righteousness kesa sa kasamaan at sa kadiliman. He finds relationships to be a gift and encourages his readers to enjoy life and the fruits of their labor. The teacher likewise advises that the pursuit of meaning in life is meaningless and is best left to God, who has imprinted eternity in our hearts. Our finite minds can only comprehend so much of an infinite God. Hindi natin, para tayong umiinom mula sa fire hydrant. Instead of letting ourselves be overwhelmed by this burden of the gods, the teacher presents faith in God as the better alternative. Sa unang tingin, talaga mukhang existentialist ang tema ng Ecclesiastes. And many Christians, they tend to avoid Ecclesiastes kasi yun nga, Ecclesiastes napaka-nega. So most of the time, ang Ecclesiastes parang pinagpipilian na lang, kinukuha yung mga magaganda pakinggan na verses. Pero actually, napakaganda po ng storya na tinuturo po sa atin ng Ecclesiastes, especially given its background. And ito po yung summary na binibigay po sa atin ni Philip Yancey. Yung storya po ng First Kingdom traces its origins to Genesis 12, kung saan pinili ng Diyos ang isang matanda na nomad, yung palipat-lipat po siya ng lugar. Pero marami po siyang pag-aari, yun nga lang wala siyang anak. At pinili siya ng Diyos para maging ugat ng isang holy nation and a chosen people. Ang pangalan nito, ng lalaking ito ay Abram, pero binago ng Diyos ang kanyang pangalan to Abraham, and he established a covenant, an agreement with him. Eventually, dumami po yung pamilya po ni Abraham, and however, naging slaves po sila sa pinaka makapangyarihang nation at the time, which is Egypt. After several hundred years, ay dineliver po sila. Sila po ay niligtas ng Diyos from slavery through the mighty works of the Exodus. And then 40 years of wilderness wanderings. And after nun, naging handa na ang Israel para kunin ang lupa na ipinangako po sa kanila. The conquest was swift and decisive, and soon enough the Israelites would settle down into cities that they did not build and enjoy gardens that they did not plant. Eventually, ito pong nation po na ito, it would grow into a kingdom and almost into an empire. It was strategically placed along trade routes, and it was backed by an omnipotent God na kinatatakutan ng mga surrounding nations. Yung pinaka peak po ng history ito, ng First Kingdom na ito, was when God Himself manifested His presence during the dedication of Solomon's temple. Nagkaroon ng apoy, mga trumpets, liwanag, na to the point na hindi na makakilos yung mga priests doing their duties. And everything was working as it should. Napaka-stable na ng kingdom, napaka-sigasig ng trade, napakaganda po ng kanilang ekonomiya. Dumadating ang mga bisita mula sa mga nations from Africa or probably as far as India kasi gusto nilang makita, wow, ang ganda ng Jerusalem and all its palaces and its temple, and gusto nilang makita or marinig yung wisdom ng king na nagahari sa kanila. In the words of many fairy tales, this was the happily ever after na pinaka-high point nung first kingdom na yon. However, it was not meant to be. Overwhelmed with the burden of God-given wisdom, Solomon gave himself over to an endless pursuit of luxury and pleasure. Maganda yung temple, gumawa siya ng palasyo twice the size and the grandeur of the temple. Mas malaki yung kanyang palasyo. Gumawa siya ng mga gold shields na useless kasi malambot po ang gold, and he taxed the people more than they could bear. Nagkaroon siya ng napakaraming asawa. And these, yung kanyang mga babae, they led Solomon's heart away from God. The Solomonic era was the highlight of the covenant that God made with His people. Ironically, it was also the downhill point in history as Solomon himself instituted idolatry in the kingdom. Yung hari na nag-dedicate ng temple sa Diyos, siya rin yung naglayo dun sa temple at sinabi na sambahin nyo ang mga gods ninyo dito sa lugar na ito. Hindi nagtagal or several 100 years later, nahati yung kingdom and eventually nilamon ang kingdom na ito. Kinuha yung mga tao and they were brought into exile. Napaka-tragic po ng story ng first kingdom po nito, and that is the kingdom of Israel, yung history po nila. The story of the second kingdom picks up from the ashes of the first. So, after natapos po yung itinak ng oras, yung nakatak ng panahon, nakabalik po yung mga Jews into their homeland and they were allowed to rebuild. Several centuries later, ang kanilang pong bayan, although hindi kasing engrande nung time po ni Solomon, meron na silang sariling hari and nakatayo na din po yung temple. However, it was under the all-powerful Roman Empire. During this time, a king was born as a baby in Bethlehem. And siya po ay nagmula sa royal line of David. In-announce ng mga angels yung kanyang kapanganakan. And interestingly, yung unang mga bisita po, mga shepherds. The boy, as we know, Jesus, later grew up to be a carpenter like his father. And he set out later to establish a new kingdom, the kingdom of heaven. Sino po yung mga members ng kanyang kingdom? Yung pong mga lumpo, yung mga mahihirap, yung mga inaapi, yung mga ritually unclean, yung mga itinatakwil ng lipunan. And his ideas on this new kingdom were also different. Nung panahon po ni Solomon, Solomon's kingdom succeeded by accumulation. Kailangan maraming territory, kailangan mataas ang wealth, ang prosperity. The kingdom of Jesus succeeds by self-sacrifice. Time and again, Jesus' followers, although devoted po sila sa pagpapalago ng kingdom, nag-aaway-away sila kasi gusto nilang maging sila yung greatest. And tinatanong nila si Jesus kung, when are you going to restore the kingdom to Israel? Nalaman or naintindihan lang nila ang lahat ng ito nung si Jesus ay naipako sa isang Roman cross and resurrected in 3 days. Doon lang nila naintindihan na yung kingdom of heaven, yung second kingdom na ito, was not a political kingdom, but an eternal one. So alam po natin yung ending po actually nitong second kingdom na ito, pero hindi lang natin alam kung kailan mangyayari. And those who are truly followers of Jesus are still in the work of expanding it. Pero gaya po ng mga first followers ni Jesus, madali po tayong nadidistract. Kasi ang hinahanap po natin yung mga visible reminders, yung visible kingdom, gaya nung kingdom ni Solomon. Ang hinahanap po natin, blessings, prosperity, wealth, territory. And mapakalayo po nito dun sa tinuturo po ni Jesus. We find the realization that Ecclesiastes is ancient and yet modern and prophetic because we still choose the allure of the visible kingdom. Mas pipiliin po natin yung visible kingdom instead of the unseen and eternal one. Although Solomon was most likely not the teacher, Ecclesiastes offers Solomon as a stark object lesson of a life without God at the center. Na kay Solomon na ang lahat. Wealth, power, wisdom, everything that one could ask from God. And he still ended up leading his people to destruction. Ito po ang katotohanan at ito po ang dahilan kung bakit ang Ecclesiastes ay part ng Bible. At dapat na mas basahin at mas pag-aralan nating mga Kristiyano. For us Jesus believers of the modern times, Ecclesiastes offers a corrective view of the world and reminds us that in the end, putting our faith in God and letting Him be the center of our lives is still the right and the only way to live a meaningful life. So dyan po, nagtatapos ang ating pong pag-aaral ng Ecclesiastes. Tayo po ay magre-resume po next session sa ating pong pagpapatuloy ng pag-aaral on the Bible that Jesus read. God bless you and keep you.